Welcome to Infinite Models. If you like building aircraft, any type of armor, how about prehistoric or current wildlife? Autos of all shapes and sizes and genres, seafaring subjects of all types, and figures, vignettes, and dioramas, then this group was made for you.
Now, tonight's live is going to run a little longer than an hour. I make no apologies. I have a really cool beginning. Tonight is not the story. Tonight is part 1 of 5 of the story. Steve and Ross, drink some coffee, guys. Hang in there, walk around the house, keep your wind about you. You're going to love this opening on the story. But the Catalina, and I've got one of my Catalina models back here. These aircraft were more important than a lot of people realize. If you think about, and you say, what are the most important aircraft of World War II from the Allied side, from the U.S., from the Axis side, from the Germans? A lot of people would come up with things like, the F-4U Corsair did this, or the F-6F Hellcat had the highest kill-to-loss ratio, et cetera, et cetera. We would put a lot of stock in things like how many kills did they make? What was their kill-to-loss ratio? What was their endurance? What was their firepower? What was their bombing or attack capabilities? How much stuff could they carry? And you start to classify and quantify aircraft on those characteristics. But what we don't do is quantify those by just the sheer impact that they had in identifying where the enemy was. That actually took the fight to the enemy without any support so early in the war. The ones that had their noses so bloodied that they virtually disappeared from the theater altogether. And yet from that, those very humble beginnings, fought their way back to the extent that they were pivotal and critical to victory in the Pacific. And the PBY Catalina is just that subject. And so I want to share with you guys. I'm going to go through about 4 sections here tonight. I'm going to start with what I'd call a taste of defeat, and then we're going to talk about the desperate days, the early days, the desperate days of World War II. I'm going to tell you about Cold Turkey Alley, and then I'm going to tell you about Back to Corregidor. And so, October 1941, there was a captain in the Navy who was assigned to Patrol Wing 2, Pat Wing 2, headquartered at Ford Island in Hawaii, on Oahu. And so this guy shows up, and not long after he got there, he was promoted. The Black Cats were amazing. We don't finish them yet. No Honor Friday. Paulo, you're in rare form tonight, buddy. Stop bloodying my nose, will you? Good Lord. Okay. Pat Wing 2 was on Ford Island. They were operating PBY-4 aircraft. They didn't have many of them. They were woefully, in a TO&E, Table of Organization and Equipment, they were woefully short on aircraft and on personnel. Their training, just frankly, it sucked. So this guy shows up October of 1941, and he starts making observations, and he fires a letter off up through his chain of command. And he says, we need more aircraft. I need more pilots and mechanics and gunners and maintainers and radiomen. And I need more training. And this guy really he sees the writing on the wall for the coming war with Japan. But there aren't a lot of people who are listening, right? And he's asking for all this, but there's none that's forthcoming. So he gets promoted to Rear Admiral. And he sits down with a brigadier general who was the commander of the U.S. Army Air Corps forces on Hawaii. And they start coming together and discussing what the needs are to protect the Hawaiian Islands in light of what they believe to be the coming war with Japan. And these two guys decide that they need 700-mile radius of patrols, 360 degrees around the Hawaiian Islands, so that they can detect a Japanese fleet approaching, because their fear was an air assault by carrier-borne aircraft launched about 300 miles from the Hawaiian Islands. They documented this in their paper. 300-mile launch, 700-mile patrols, 360-degree coverage. And so that was what they envisioned, and how prophetic it was, because the Japanese, when they did launch their attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, did so from 230 miles away. They were within that 300-mile radius, undetected. But their focus was training. So the first thing this admiral does is he starts a pretty heavy training regimen. He has aircraft in the air as often as he can. And when he has the aircraft in the air, and the syllabus that he's trying to put in place was to have them prosecuting submarine targets, and he'd have them coordinating with U.S. submarines out of Hawaii. And the PBYs would try to find them, prosecute them, do simulated drops, strafing runs, and so on. And the crews were ordered to fly with their 50 cals on the aircraft, and armed and fully loaded on each of those flights. And so you had typically a 30 caliber gun was in a little well deck in the aft end of the airplane that fired out through the belly of the airplane aftwards. You had the two blister guns, and they had 50 cals in there. And then you had a turret up front on some, where some of them hadn't enclosed, a lot of them were just open, but there was a turret with a pair of 50 cals up there. So this admiral orders that every flight, they must have the 50 cals installed and loaded for every flight. He wants people to get used to doing this. Unfortunately, on 23 November, two full squadrons, 24 airplanes per squadron, two full squadrons of PBY 5 and 5A aircraft show up at Kaneohe Bay. That brings the total on Hawaii to 81 patrol planes. I'm glad you're here, Justin, and I'm glad you didn't forget. So on 23 November, Hawaii is now up to 81 patrol aircraft. I'm not going to talk about the P-40s and the Brewster Buffaloes and the OS-GU Kingfishers. This is, like I said, the next 5 nights, next 5 Fridays is going to be all about the Catalina. So 81 Catalinas on the island. And he wants them to always fly fully loaded with 50 cal. What they didn't know on 23 November when these aircraft showed up was that on 5 November, the Japanese cabinet, they call it the Diet, had gotten together and voted and proposed to the emperor, who approved going to war with the United States. And Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, he contacted Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, and Admiral Nagumo was the commander of their assault forces, told him to finish preparations and launch for the Hawaiian Islands. And so on 26 November, their preparations were finished, and Admiral Nagumo and his entire fleet, they departed Hitakapu Bay up in the Kuriles Islands. So, hey, Scott, good to see you, buddy. Glad you're in here from Raleigh, North Carolina. So they depart, and they start heading south by southeast towards Hawaii. In the meantime, the U.S. commanders are begging for airplanes, begging for people, begging for provisions, begging for ammunition, begging, warning about coming hostilities, all to no avail. On the morning of 7 December, there were 4 PBY Catalinas airborne. Unfortunately, they happened to be southeast and southwest of Hawaii, and the Japanese fleet came in from the northeast, and, well, guess what? They were not in the air. They didn't detect them. They didn't know where they were at, and they didn't know what was coming. One of the PBYs was flying along and came down near the mouth of the bay and where Ford Island was, and lo and behold, there was a midget sub, and he attacked that submarine and radioed back at 7:20 in the morning that he had just attacked a midget submarine at the mouth of the bay. And a lot of the commanders and the people there thought he meant that a U.S. sub had actually gone within the secured area by accident, and this guy was assaulting an American submarine. So they were trying to sort that out. That happened at 7:20. He radios it in, and while they're trying to figure out just what the heck was going on, 7:55 in the morning, the first bomb from the Japanese dive bombers struck the ground. And irony of ironies, that first bomb struck on the apron to VP-22 and their hangar for the PBYs at Ford Island. And so the very first bomb, 0755, hits the PBY apron. All hell breaks loose. You guys all know the story of the Pearl Harbor attack in 2 waves. Just when they thought it was over, the second wave hits and you know, all hell breaks loose again. The chaos that ensued, they run the Nevada aground on purpose to keep it from sinking. The Arizona going up when its magazine was hit, and so on and so on and so forth. So you guys know what happened at Pearl Harbor. Well, on that day, by the end of the day, what had happened for the Catalinas was that 26 of them out of the 81 that were there, 26 Catalinas were completely destroyed. Most of them on the ground. You guys have seen the photographs of the one that broke in half with the wings, the top of the wings visible because it's kind of from the rear left-hand quarter, fuselage in half from the bomb that exploded. You've seen the photographs of the one that looks like a skeleton, all burned out, nothing but the frame left, and, you know, aircraft burned up. So 26 Catalinas completely destroyed. 7 more are badly, badly damaged. There's only 3 flyable that were actually in the air at the time of the attack. And one of those was riddled with bullet holes. The one that made the attack on the midget submarine was near the bay. And that one, he wound up being pounced by Japanese fighters. So they got 3 flyable PBYs at the end of the day. They were able to go about cannibalizing aircraft on the ground. And they got a 4th one flyable by the end of that day. And the commander, the Navy admiral, is telling them, launch, 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 go find that Japanese fleet before it recedes, and we never are able to find it. So they launched, but it was all to no avail. They never found that Japanese fleet, and they did slip away. And so that, you know, 7 December 1941 was very much a taste of defeat. And the Catalinas took it wholly, completely on the chin that day. Well, the desperate days of World War II, from that moment forward, were just starting. U.S. commanders all over the Pacific are trying to figure out, you know, what target is next. And so they start making preparations and trying to figure out where they're going to be. In the Philippine Islands, you had Patrol Wing 10, Pat Wing 10. They were flying PBY-4 aircraft in 2 squadrons, VP-101 and VP-102. They had 28 total Catalinas in the Philippines. And so the commander there, he decided, since he had heard what happened at Hawaii, right? They're in 2 locations, Ford Island and Kaneohe, wiped out. So he takes and he disperses his Catalinas all over the Philippines to try to keep them safe. So he put 7 of them down at Sangley Point, and Sangley Point was across Manila Bay from the Cavite Naval Base. He had a detachment at Los Banos, which was at the southernmost end of Laguna de Bay Lake. And then he had 7 at Olongapo City in the Subic Bay. He had a detachment with a seaplane tender, the name of which was the Childs, and that was anchored at Manila. He had 3 PBYs were at the southern end of Mindanao, off the city of Davos. In Davos, this is Davos Gulf. They were at the southern end of here at Davos Gulf. And then he had a detachment with another seaplane tender called the Heron, which was on the southern end of the Palawan Islands. And I didn't draw it in here, but Palawan runs out from kind of in a southeasterly direction. And so they had more off a seaplane tender out here. So he's dispersed his PBYs all over the place. Now, the value of these aircraft cannot really be overstated for what we're going through. Number one, the Japanese onslaught that begins and their expansionism in the Pacific. U.S. commanders, let me back up just one second. U.S. commanders had a pretty low opinion of the Japanese, not just their military writ large, but individual pilots and soldiers and so on. They really looked down their nose at them and figured they were, slope foreheaded, dull, slow people, incapable of individual thought. And they watched the attack at Pearl Harbor, and that admiral was noticing how nimble their aircraft were. He noticed how they used the fighters to protect the torpedo bombers and the dive bombers, the Vals and the Kates. And we were astonished at how effective they set up their assault forces and how effective they were in execution. And then the same thing happened in the Philippines, and in every bit as they marched their way south through the Pacific, the path of destruction that they wrought, our entire perception of the Japanese military, its soldiers, its equipment, was completely changed. So here they're dispersing all the aircraft to get them, kind of spread out. The value of these airplanes are that this onslaught is coming and we need to find them. We need to isolate where they are, track where they're moving to predict the next landing, the next assault, the next island to fall. So we can try to counter with, frankly, what we had was very pitiful forces, ships, and otherwise, to try to counter this. And so in the Philippine Islands, they had all these aircraft are dispersed, and they had several up and surveying around the Philippine Islands, trying to determine where the landings were coming from. And already two had taken up well to the north and near Luzon Island, and they were coming south into Manila. So we are searching not only in the South China Sea, but the Pacific, looking for where's the next Japanese assault coming. And one of the pilots, he actually found a Japanese assault ship and the whole group. And it was comprised of like 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers and several merchantmen. And this was just the opportunity that the commander of Pat Wing 10 was looking for. He figured he was going to hook him by the nose and, kick him in the butt. This was our chance. And so they launched 5 Catalinas. All 5 had 2 under each wing, 500-pound bombs. And these 5 aircraft are going to go throw 20 bombs at all of these merchantmen and so on. And we're going to, just punch these guys in the nose. So they start flying. And the aircraft that spotted the Japanese fleet, it's kind of an overcast, broken clouds kind of situation for them. And he's like dashing from cloud cover to remain hidden, yet tracking the Japanese fleet. Now they in time become aware that he's there and they're being tracked by an American plane. And he starts sending out the Morse code of MO. And MO is, dash, 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 dash. And when you send out that 2 and 3 dash sequence, it is something that the radio direction finding equipment can lock onto very well. So these 5 Catalinas are locked onto the MO signal coming from the pilot, and he's dashing from cloud to cloud. And these guys are talking on the way over, and they decide that they've got the bomb sites. They didn't have the Norden, not a real good one yet, but they didn't have Norden bomb sites. So they had bomb sites. And they decide, since it's merchantmen, slow-moving, not really combat ships, being escorted by destroyers and cruisers, but they've got to stay, with their quarry and get them to safety. So they're not worried about a whole lot of defensive maneuvers. They're going to do a level bombing run, 30,000 feet on these merchantmen. And so they start making their approach, and because of the clouds, they're too high. They had to descend. And they get down, and they're coming through the clouds, and the Japanese start sending up anti-aircraft fire. And it's kind of falling short at first. About 2 minutes out, the fire starts. About a minute from bomb drop, the Japanese have gotten their altitude, they've gotten their azimuth, they've gotten the direction, and the AC becomes very accurate. And these guys are flying into it, and so they're like, oh, if we stay on a level bombing run, we're just flying into all this flak. So they decide to break up, tip it over, and use the Mark 1 Mod 0 eyeball, the sailor's eye, and drop the bombs on these Japanese ships. So they kind of break up, and it becomes every man for himself, but everybody is going after the merchantmen, destroy all the soldiers before they can get to the land. They tip over, they start their bombing runs, and every single bomb lands behind the boats in their wake. There was one that hit close astern, and then there was one that actually looked like a hit on the stern of a boat, and it started a 360-degree turn and came out of that and wound up on a new heading of about 020, but it was going really slow. And so they think they may have damaged the rudder or maybe, the propellers, and they start radioing back. In the meantime, these 5 Catalinas come under attack from Japanese aircraft that had launched from another carrier that was part of another group. These ships were calling for help as they're doing kind of a little bit of a zigzag defensive pattern. The Japanese fighters roll in, and these 5 Catalinas start ducking into clouds. They're going into dives, and they're doing everything they can to get away from the Japanese fighters. In the meantime, their radio back tell them that they think they hit one. Here's the location. They've got them frozen, and so back at Sangley Point, they take 4 more Catalinas and they load them up with torpedoes and launch them out to go finish off this merchantman, maybe get some more before the actual invasion takes place. Those 4 cats, the way a Catalina takes off, when the plane is in the water and it's taxiing, they sit very low in the water. And they have that boat hull underside of the fuselage. And so the water is basically at the crown of that hull. Well, when you have torpedoes, they actually sit really low in the water, and under the upper curve, the water's up there right underneath the blisters in the rear. Well, they have to build up enough speed when you hit the throttles. They have to build up enough speed so that the lift of the wings and the shape of the hull in the water pushing the boat up, they come up to what's called on the step. You go from in the water to on the step, and from on the step, they'll break the water and go into powered flight. So these 4 Catalinas are carrying their torpedoes, and they're taxiing out at Sangley Point. Now, Sangley Point, like I said, is where'd I go? Across the bay from Cavite Naval Base. And when you're in those alcoves in those bays, you have to worry about semi-submerged coral reefs. If the water's low enough, low tide, you can actually taxi into that and rip your hull open. Floating debris, logs, boats in the water. Most of them were hand carved out little canoes and stuff, but there were other kinds of boats, some big, some small. All this stuff is in the way, and now they're carrying these torpedoes. They're low in the water, they're moving, they're trying to taxi out. And the first 2 begin their takeoff run, and they're heading out, and they just get up on the step. The second 2 start to throttle forward, and they're moving forward out of the Sangley Bay. And coming out of the sky, they didn't even get off the ground. They just were savaged by Japanese fighters. Those 4 with the torpedoes never made it to the fight. They don't believe they actually were able to destroy that merchantman as it made its way in. And so right there, the opening day of combat on 10 December in the Philippines was the result of they lost 3 of the 5 Catalinas to fighters that actually made bombing attacks on the ships. They lost 4, didn't even get into the air. 7 PBYs in one day, and it just was not looking good for the home team. On 12 December, they launched 7 more from all of those dispersed areas. They reached out to the boats that were the flying boats that were at Olongapo in Subic Bay, and they launched 7 of them to go into search patterns to find, because the Japanese are still coming south with their convoys, coming south with their merchantmen. They're bringing more destroyers and cruisers to bear. They know there's going to be more assaults because they have to work their way south and get from Luzon down to Mindanao and everything in between. Certainly the Corregidor. And so they know there's more assaults coming. So they launched 7 aircraft to go out and try to find the Japanese assault fleet. These 7 airplanes, they're carrying 250, 500-pound bombs. They got 50 cal machine guns all loaded up, and they're searching for the Japanese fleet. And those airplanes were in the air for 12 hours on 12 December, searching and searching and searching. They had 2 crews, so they could swap out and always have a fresh crew flying the airplane. One crew flew for 6 hours, then they swapped out another crew. So you had the first pilot and the second pilot and a first co-pilot and a second co-pilot, you know, first waist gunner, second waist gunner, the whole 9 yards. 7 aircraft. Never found the Japanese fleet. Unfortunately, given the altitude they were flying and the search patterns they were flying, they were spotted by Japanese fighters who were rolling in to cover the next assault wave coming a little further south down towards Mindanao. And so these 7 cats turned and head home to land in Subic Bay to come back to Olongapo. And when the 7 of them are in the water and taking turns taxiing in and coming up to their moorings where they can then be camouflaged and set aside, hidden from the air, the Japanese knew right where they were at. And the fighters that tracked them led twin-engine medium bombers to their bases at Olongapo, and they were just savaged, destroyed at their moorings, all 7 aircraft. So by 12 December, 17 PBYs of the original 28 in Pat Wing 10, 17 remain. Only 11 are flyable. They finally get the order. We can't hold, you know, the Philippines. 15 December, all flyable PBYs are ordered to start flying south and to get down to the Dutch East Indies for safety. And so they had 11 of them, and they all try to take off. 11 PBYs fly out. I told you 17 of the 28 remained. Well, only 11 were flyable. Those 11 aircraft on 15 December take off to head for the Dutch East Indies. And as they got down there, a couple of them were still in such poor shape. One of them, the engine seized, and it started falling back, and it was attacked by Japanese fighters and shot down. So 10 of them land, and when they get down to the Dutch East Indies, they take those 10 aircraft from VP 102 and VP 101, and they consolidate them into a single squadron. Now, mind you, they left like 6 aircraft that were not flyable. They were damaged, but not like badly damaged. They just were not flyable. And so the hope was that they could make repairs to those 6 aircraft, and they would fly out later and catch up with the rest in the Dutch East Indies, where we could regroup and begin to think about what we can do to slow this onslaught that was coming from the Japanese. Unfortunately, those 6 were discovered by marauding. You know, the Japanese just owned the air by that point, and they were destroyed by marauding Japanese fighters, and those 6 were also lost. So the losses between Hawaii and the Philippines were just astronomical. The Japanese continue their march south, and I want to tell you, when you think about this, they were moving south in all of these. They had flotillas of merchantmen loaded with soldiers to perform the attacks. Those were escorted by cruisers and battleships too, but cruisers and destroyers mainly. And then they had their carrier groups. They had some fast carriers, and they had a couple of heavy carriers, and those were their main forces. And as they came south through the Pacific, they would take over every island along their way that had an airstrip, and then they would fly land-based aircraft to those airstrips, so that the land-based aircraft, which then you have a longer runway than a carrier, so you can carry more ordnance, you can carry more fuel, you can make longer range raids. But the point is that supplementing their carrier aircraft, they kept taking all these islands with the airfields and supplementing all of that with land-based aircraft. So now they've got G4M Betty bombers, and they've got Ki-46 bombers and Ki-43 bombers, and just on and on and on. And the Japanese are marching incredibly without resistance south. And so we determined that we needed to try. They attacked an area called Jolo. There's an island way down here near the Makassar Strait. Jolo Island had Jolo Air Base. Japanese took that over, and so our first determination was that Jolo was close enough that we needed to actually attack Jolo and show the Japanese that they could not be comfortable basically in our front yard. They were getting so close to our home down here in Australia and everything that was around there. So during this time, what happened, this is like in January, February of 1942, ABDACOM was formed. Now, ABDACOM, an acronym of course, and what it stood for was the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command. And so you had the ABDACOM, American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, was brought together, and the purpose of ABDACOM was to try to come up with a battle plan to blunt the onslaught. Now, we didn't have nearly as many ships as the Japanese did. Of all, whether it was American, British, Dutch, or Australian, we did not have a navy the size of the Japanese Navy. We did not have aircraft to go toe-to-toe with the Japanese aircraft. We did not have soldiers and sailors and airmen. We were just unbelievably, between those four countries, grossly outnumbered, vastly outnumbered by the Japanese in that theater. And so the hard part was trying to get things, assets there to bear to blunt this onslaught was just not happening. And so ABDACOM is formed. And the irony in this is, if you look at a map of the Southwest Pacific area for, from December through April, December 41 to April of 42, and you start looking at who owns and operates, as a magistrate, all of the different countries and islands and areas, everybody had different political, they had different geopolitical, and they had different strategic goals for the areas they controlled. And so, the Dutch were worried about the East Indies, and the British were worried about Singapore, and the Australians, of course, were worried about New Guinea, New Britain, and Australia. The Americans really had no vested interest in any of this other than they were all allies, and we were just, incredibly getting our butts kicked all the way out of the entire Pacific region. And so ABDACOM's formed, and the infighting starts, and nothing's really happening. We're just getting usurped and beaten the daylights out of by the Japanese. And we finally determined that, okay, we're going to hit them at Jolo, and we're going to show them that they cannot be comfortable in our front yard like this. It's just got to stop. And so they set up the raid, and they launch 6 PBYs to go attack the ships in the harbors and the port at Jolo Island. So these guys launch, and again, just like going after the ships up in the Philippines, they determined they're going to do a level bombing attack because it's a port, it's not ships, they're not zigzagging, they're not moving. This should be a pretty easy attack. And so they launched 6 Catalinas to head to Jolo. And when they were coming in, their first approach, the winds were not right for the approach to drop the bombs and be effective. So they're trying to hop through cloud cover and change their angle to come in from another direction. It alerted the Japanese. They launched float planes like the A6M2N. Roof was up, several of those. They actually had some A6M0s were launched, and then they had all of their anti-aircraft batteries were in place. They start throwing up a barrage of ACAC, and these 6 Catalinas they got into such a mess. It became every man for himself. They're tipping over, they're trying to dive. They did hit one cruiser and sank it in the port. But for those 6 aircraft, Ensign Chrisman is flying his Catalina, and he had a roof coming in from his rear quarter. And what he did was he turned into it. And so by turning into the roof that was coming, he fouled the pilot's approach and deflection shot. and the pilot actually of the roof had to brake right and up to avoid hitting the Catalina. And he rolls up and comes back, and he tries to come in from an elevated right quarter attack. And during that pass, he punctured the fuel tanks in his airplane. The starboard side blister gunner was killed in that assault. The port side blister gunner, he's still trying to fire back, and he's actually bouncing between both guns, trying to fight at enemies that are coming in now from all angles. And because he punctured the tank, some of the next hits actually ignited it, and the Catalina starts on fire. And so he can't even turn the aircraft to go into the wind. He actually starts a with the wind approach to put the bird down to try to get his crew to safety. When they pass through about 300 feet, the first mech and one of the gunners jumped out of the airplane. It's like engulfed in flames. They jump out of the airplane. The pilot was actually able to put the aircraft on the water, come to a stop, and these guys start exiting the airplane. The co-pilot was hit in the head. He's bleeding profusely, but while setting the airplane down, it was the co-pilot who was jockeying the throttle controls while the pilot is fighting the stick and rudder, because the attacks from the aircraft, they couldn't put their floats down on the wingtips. They were in the locked position. He lost an engine, so he's like trying to keep the aircraft stable. If you catch a wingtip, it'll cartwheel in the water and kill everybody. So honestly, one hell of a landing, given all, planes on fire, no tip floats, engine out, the co-pilot bleeding from that. And they put it down and landed and got it to a stop without cartwheeling. These guys start getting out of the airplane, and now they're looking around and they're figuring, where are we going to swim to? How are we? And so they pull out one of the life rafts, and it's riddled with bullet holes. They pull the second life raft out, and fortunately it inflated properly. But now they're on this giant yellow donut in the middle of the deep blue sea. And so to try to camouflage themselves, they took a bunch of their navy dungarees, the dark blue and light blue between the pants and the shirts, and they're putting dungarees all around the lifeboat to camouflage it from the Japanese for being strafed in the water. And they start rowing for land. One of the other Catalinas, it too was attacked, and fortunately, one of the events that took place for that other Catalina that was under attack was he had a Japanese plane came into him from his rear right quarter, and the blister gunner on the right hand side swings the gun back, and he starts firing for everything he's worth, throwing rounds at that zero. Well, it ducked down, and the guy, the mechanic, was on the belly with the 30 cal out the door through the belly of the airplane, and he goes down, and the 30 cal starts lighting him up. So he ducks and pulls up in front of the Catalina and does a wing over to the left. Well, as he does that, the pilot kicked in a bunch of right rudder and skids his Catalina, which put the port side blister gunner right to bear, and he lit up that zero and actually shot it, and it burst into flames and rolled over on its back and down into the water. So an amazing kill, given everything else that they're going through. Unfortunately, that was only one, and they were surrounded by dozens of Japanese fighters, and the next ones got them, and they wound up, again, heading into the water, landing dead stick, in their case, on the water. They start trying to get away from the plane because there was a pair of float planes that were now coming down and strafing the Catalina, trying to destroy it. And it's a tough old bird. They made some strafing passes at it, and it's still afloat, and those planes pulled off and left because there was bigger fish to fry somewhere else. And these guys then, they're like, well, what the heck? So they swim back to the Catalina, and they're trying to get radio gear. They're trying to call for help, let people know what's going on. They're getting safety gear, sea rations, medical supplies. Well, the first co-pilot on that bird happened to be like darn near an Olympic swimmer. And so he says, I'm going to swim for land. You guys catch up in the boat. I'm going to try to find help. And he swims off. And so for all these things going on, these guys wind up on different islands. They were taken in by natives on one island and a Dutch missionary on another. The natives that took them in on one island led them to a school teacher who was like an Australian teaching at this island to the natives, and he helped get them care. And on the other one, this Dutch, pulls them in, and he gets some help. And they finally take them via native boats to a third island. And from there, Catalinas were sent to pick them up and take them back to base. Well, when they got them back, Ensign Chrisman, in his after-action report, he wrote that under no circumstances should PBY aircraft be used where they will come in contact with enemy fighter planes unless protected by fighter convoy. Unfortunately, at this point in the war, there was no fighter convoy to be had to support the Cats. So Cold Turkey Alley, if you understand the area in the west at Borneo, all the way back over to the east at Rabaul, and running north from Darwin, north to the northern end of Borneo, this area in here became known as Cold Turkey Alley. And they called it Cold Turkey Alley because that's what you became if you flew in there. The Japanese owned the air. Everything got shut down. It was just Cold Turkey Alley. And the Japanese were making their advance, and the value of the aircraft, like I said, cannot be understated for trying to track them and slow them and blunt this onslaught. But if you read the history, you know, Ambon fell, and then the Makassar Strait fell. Balikpapan and the oil refinery there fell. Surabaya. By 11 February, 12 of the 45 Pat Wing 10 aircraft were left. That's it, 12. And 5 were in flyable condition, but of those 5, they all had critically high engine times. And so just the struggles. And then you watch the rest of that. On February 16th, Singapore fell. Palembang, Sumatra fell. There was a big oil refinery there. Bandar Jasmine, Borneo, falls. Bali on the 18th of February, and even on the 19th of February, 1941, the Japanese made an incredible aerial assault on Darwin, Australia. They owned everything. The spectacular repeated success by them, they seemed invincible. And at this point in the war, they really, truly were. And so those were the dark, early, desperate days. But in any event, the dark early days of the war, it was just getting, they're down to 3 aircraft in Pat Wing 10, virtually decimated. And the amazing thing is, at that point, Pat Wing 10 received a call. And that call was they needed to get medical, food, and ammunition supplies to the last of the stubborn resistors on Corregidor in the Philippines. They had held out for 4 months, from December to April. They had held out for 4 months against the Japanese in overwhelming odds. They were running low on everything. And so the Catalina was perfectly suited for what they needed, with a long-range aircraft that could fly and navigate at night, carry multiple crews to make these 16-hour, 17-hour missions and flights, and to carry supplies to them. And at the same time, they wanted to gather up a number of passengers and evacuate them from the Philippines, because it was going to fall just at any moment. And so way, way, way down in the southwest in Perth, Australia, was where they moved all of their Catalinas to keep them out of range of the Japanese. So on the 27th of April, the PBYs take off and they fly up to Sharks Bay, and they hit a seaplane tender there and kind of top off their fuel. And then they fly on over along the coast to Darwin. And at Darwin, they actually flew over and came up the mouth of a river, and they taxied up the river inland a bit to keep them out of the view of the Japanese that were just running roughshod over everything. And so the next day, they taxi out of the river, they go to Darwin, and they just load them up with all these supplies. Now, mind you, the Japanese own everything between Darwin and the Philippines. And so these guys take off at 16:30 on the 28th of April, and they depart Darwin towards the Banda Sea, and they're going to try to bend and thread their way around and between all of these islands that we had lost in the previous 4 months, that the Japanese now occupy, and they're doing it at night. So it's, long distance over water navigation at night. And they have to sit down and hide during the day and get to Corregidor to bring some relief to these people. So they leave Darwin and they thread their way through all this. And, between the Celebes Sea and the Banda Sea, they make another stop to refuel. And then they fly all the way up to the Davao Bay in Mindanao, just south of Davao itself. And from there, they fly over to a place called Lake Lanao. And Lake Lanao is where it's an inland freshwater lake, and it hasn't been overrun by the Japanese yet. So this is where they're going to kind of park, refuel, wait for nightfall the next night to make their flight over to the Corregidor. And so they had radio contact with some people, and the folks at Lake Lanao were going to flash a flashlight at them, in a sequence of beams to let them know where they are at. And they're going to park there to do all their stuff. I wish I could mute this and go upstairs and close the door. I'm sorry I didn't close the door before I started. So they see the blinking lights. They land. Now, mind you, this is night. And when you try to land a flying boat on the water at night, you don't have the reference points of a horizon. There's no lights. Everybody's blacked out because they're trying to avoid the Japanese and getting shot up. But they have a radar altimeter, but over water, they're not the most reliable piece of equipment. And so they throttle back and they're settling down, and they get to a point where the thing reads 300 feet, and the pilot will literally drive the Catalina onto the water. And to do that is a little harder a landing than what they would normally do, but they've got to get it down and then get it settled on the step before it, sinks down to the sill to taxi. Well, again, there's been war through this whole area up to this point. And so floating debris, floating tree logs, boats in blackout conditions, semi-submerged coral reefs, all these things can happen. And they have to land on the open sea and taxi into these areas for safety. Well, Lake Lanao is not open sea, but they have, because it's a lake, you don't have the run out distance like you do the open sea. So they have to drive it down quickly and throttle back quickly. And so they do, and they're looking for darkened vessels and reefs and so on, and they taxi in, they get let in by lights, and they come up underneath a whole bunch of trees overhanging Lake Lanao, tie up the aircraft, they fresh cut jungle underbrush are laid all on, and they camouflage them. And so the crew goes in, and some equipment's being loaded on the planes that was there to take over to Corregidor, and the crew tries to get some rest because they've been flying since Perth, Australia. Now they're all the way up in the Philippines, over 1,000 miles worth of flying, and they're trying to get some rest. So the problem is that they stirred up some natives, and the natives are now coming out to see what all the commotion is about in the airplanes, and so they're excited and excitable, and they're causing a lot of noise, and sleep was hard to come. The poor guys. So the next day, that was sleeping through the day, and that next evening they get up and they're getting ready to get going, and they got to get over to Corregidor. And so they get in the aircraft, and they go through warming up the motors and taxiing out a little bit, and then they've got to, they really have to accelerate as quickly as they can to get up on the step and airborne in the short distance they have in the lake. And they do, but in order to do so, because they had put so much supplies on the aircraft to take to the defenders at Corregidor, the airplanes are grossly overweight, so they're sitting really low in the water in a lake. And they decide that they need to strip all non-essential gear off the airplane to lighten them, to buoy them back up a little bit. And non-essential gear in this case also included the 50 cal machine guns and all of their ammunition because of the weight of that stuff. And the pilots felt like they were really losing a good friend when they started stripping the waste guns out of the planes. But they're able to get off, and they get a short flight, relatively speaking, over to Corregidor. Nighttime, they have to set down on the water again. They taxi in. So there was a larger boat that couldn't come alongside the Catalinas, so that the bigger boat launches two smaller boats, and they do this ferrying back and forth, getting supplies from the Catalina, taking people, the passengers, out to the Catalinas, back and forth. and they're trying to hurry because they're right under the noses of the Japanese, who own everything. And there was a burning oil storage tank on the land that when they got to Corregidor, that it actually, the fact that it was burning was kind of an impromptu beacon, which gave them a horizon. They were able to land a little more smoothly and not put it on the water. They had, because of the smoke rising from the fire, they had an indication of the wind direction so they could make their approach. These were all good things, but they're so worried about being hit by the Japanese, who had their artillery positions and everything else completely surrounding this area on Corregidor. But it just so happened that this day that they're making this mission was the Emperor's birthday. And it seems that the Japanese soldiers at their cannons and at their machine guns were kind of asleep at the switch. They had been partying with the sake a little too long, celebrating the Emperor's birthday. Evidently, they were not awake for this, so they get in. The shuttling has taken place, and the radioman in one of the Catalinas calls out to the other plane, kind of sarcastically, maybe a little tongue-in-cheek. He says, "Hey, you want to hurry up and get those little old ladies on the plane so we can get the hell out of here?" And he finishes his call and comes down off the perch in the sail to the parasol wing. And what does he step down into the hull of the airplane to see? 10 Army nurses were part of their evacuees. They weren't little old ladies, but they were indeed ladies that they had taken on board. So the two call signs, it was 1 boat and 7 boat on this mission. 1 boat took on 25 passengers. 7 boat took on 30 passengers. And now they're way overweight, but they've got to leave Corregidor, and they instead of flying back to Davao, which was now under attack, they're going to fly straight south and to a refueling point in the middle of Japanese hold territory so that they can refuel enough to get back to Darwin. So they had refueled at Davao, flew over to Corregidor. The engines are running on kind of an idle setting to keep them warm while they're doing the switch out and getting the passengers and offloading the cargo. And they get ready to take off, and those aircraft are heavy, heavy, heavy. So they know that they're going to have a long time to get up on the step and then airborne. Well, 7 boat taxis out, and it's ready to go. But 1 boat was having some troubles getting out of the bay, and as they hooked it up to the bigger boat to try to tow it out, the bigger boat towed 1 boat right across a semi-submerged coral reef, and it ripped the belly of the airplane wide open. Water is rushing into the Catalina. The crew's calling up to the pilots to let them know they've got 30 passengers in there. So they turn and throw the throttles on, and they on purpose run 7 boat aground to keep it from sinking right off the coast of the Corregidor under the Japanese noses. And the only thing they could do was work to repair it. Well, 7 boat had signaled 1 boat, we can't get out, go. So 1 boat with its 25 passengers takes off and starts the flight south. 7 boat, they had some local help, the defenders and some natives come there. They send a diver under. He finds the holes. He says one's really pretty big size. And what they wound up doing was they took a couple blankets and some tree bark from trees and marine glue, and they tried to fashion a patch. And they did. It wasn't completely watertight. The integrity of the hull was still compromised. They realized if they tried to put all 30 people back on, that they would never get airborne with that patch problem. And so they left 20 people. They took the 10 most critical, put them on the plane, and without waiting for the engines to warm up and everything else, they turn it, and they barely taxi when they ran up the throttles right under the nose of the Japanese to get the heck out of there, because it's taken on water. They had the blisters open, and people are bailing water out of that plane with their hands, with cups, anything they could, as quickly as they could to keep it afloat. 10 passengers, they got it on the step. They finally get airborne, and the water starts draining out the belly of the Catalina. And the people realize that they're now headed for, they're over the South China Sea. They're headed for home. They kick back, they cut on the coffee pot, and they're drinking coffee and relaxing. They're finally out of the Philippines. Both of those Catalinas made it back to Darwin, offloaded their passengers. They also brought certain bits of intelligence and information about Japanese and troop movements and stuff on the Philippines. And then they took off and flew to Perth, to where they originally started from. And in both cases, boat 7, they were bailing on that boat furiously every time it was in the water because it was taken on water. And when they got back to Perth, they purposefully ran that aircraft aground to keep it from sinking and to be able to be repaired. Kind of an end note to that story. The 20 people that they left on Corregidor because of their patch requirements, a B-17 was scheduled to fly in to Mindanao. So they were going to try to evacuate them off Corregidor over to Mindanao, down to the southern end, and they were going to have a B-17 land and take on those 20 passengers and get them out. Unfortunately, the Philippines fell on 6 May, excuse me. The Corregidor fell 6 May. The whole of the Philippines had fallen. Those 20 people, the B-17 never went in. Those 20 people and all the others that were left, U.S. and ally, fell to the Japanese, were taken prisoner and interred by the Japanese. However, such a mission, the distances flown, the fact that they had to land and take off from water at every one of their stops, all of the equipment they had to take, and the people they were trying to pull out of there. The only aircraft that we had at our disposal that was capable of even considering a mission like that was the PBY Catalina, and they pulled it off. And the multiple crews on each of those aircraft, every one of them, pilots and the crew, gunners, radiomen, mechanics, were awarded the Silver Star for heroism for that mission and for getting the 35 passengers out, 25 on one plane and 10 on the other, that they got out of there and saved their lives. Fantastic thing. But this is part 1 of 5 parts to share with you guys kind of the life and times of the PBY Catalina in World War II. I hope you enjoyed this. I look forward to seeing you guys.
We hope you have enjoyed this Infinite Models presentation.